I'm a Grand Rapids native. So I was born in Butterworth, now Spectrum Hospital, and really lived here all my life until I went away to the University of Michigan. And so um, when I think about where poetry begins for me, it wasn't in those early years, but those early years were certainly filled with reading. So I was primed when the time came. I came back to Grand Rapids in 1978, having first studied and then living and working in Southeast Michigan, suburban Detroit, and had come back once during that time for the great poetry series that Grand Valley had in the early 70s. And perhaps that was Dan Gerber's inspiration. I'm not sure, because he was teaching there at the time. And people like Robert Creeley and Robert Bly were there. And they drew huge crowds. And it was a great sort of introductory moment for a 20-something kid to the world of poetry in Grand Rapids. I had come from Ann Arbor at University of Michigan, where Donald Hall was running a wonderful reading series with everybody from Joseph Brodsky to Marge Piercy to Tom Gunn, and Robert Hayden was on the faculty there. And so it was just a very rich poetry experience there. Coming back to Grand Rapids, there wasn't much that I was aware of. And Grand Valley began to break the ice and bring a community together around poetry. And then my first memory is in 1978. I had just moved back, and I think it was Grand Rapids Community College. Dave Cope might know this. Conducted a poetry and writing workshop, and Dan Gerber and Judith Minty were the two poetry instructors for that. And so it was where I began to get to know Dan, who has done so much to inspire poetry locally. And then my first memory, again, as a poet wannabe, was Judy Minty needed to figure out how to get from the parking ramp at Community College down to the old Allen's bookshop, where they were having a reception after the party, or after the workshop. And so I jumped in the car with her and rode down with her, and that was like a big thrill, because Judith was already sort of in the pantheon of recognized regional poets, and that was the old Allen's bookshop, which I'm, old as I am, a little too young to remember that what a hub that was for literary activity. But Jim Harrison's daughter stopped by there, and Dan introduced me to her while we were at the reception there. And so that became this first immersion in local literary culture. Well, I think coming out of college as an English major and wanting to write, there were really two different directions to go. And one was further graduate work and on academic side and teaching, and the other was journalism and reporting. And so I think I was eager to get out and get a job. And the first job I got was as an intern reporter for the Observer newspapers, which was a big suburban group in Livonia, and living in Plymouth, and then became editor and publisher of a little weekly in Plymouth that competed with my old employer. But that was, so it was a desire to write and make a living doing it. Those seemed like the only options, and that was the one that I chose. I don't know that my poetry as a body of work is big enough to lay any claims to being informed by anything. But I think it does, working as a reporter really grounds you in, it does two things. It grounds you in everyday life, and it is great if you're curious, because you get to look into everybody else's lives. And so that I think the grounding experience is important, because you don't lose sight of what's important to people, and the broadening is wonderful, because you get into little nooks and crannies, from the police beat to oddball feature stories that you might never have been exposed to otherwise. I think of that time, and particularly the 1980s, as being the glory days of Race Street Gallery and the original Urban Institute for Contemporary Art. And this was over on Race Street off of Fuller Northeast. And just the magic of the moments there made poetry just an integral part of my life. Both meeting other poets. Linda Nemec Foster is coming in later. She would be among them. Bob Vandermolen is a very close friend, and he and I would frequently attend the readings together. And the Race Street was bringing in great literary figures in a community that didn't always appreciate. I don't mean in a hostile way, but just there wasn't a widespread recognition of how great these people were. I remember going out in a snowstorm one winter, and this must have been in the mid-1980s, when William Stafford was reading. And there were 5 or 6 of us in attendance, and he's one of the greatest living American poets at the time. I mean, you felt so privileged. And so, poetry has a power as a communal activity, but it also is primarily an individual moment. And that you felt like you were part of such a select tribe. And it wasn't a tribe defined by status or money or anything else. It was just by the choice of a handful of people to say, it's worth going out in a blizzard to hear William Stafford. And that was just an amazing moment. And there were many others like that in varying degrees that allowed you to connect more personally. You weren't just one person in a crowd in an auditorium. He was speaking to me as you and I are speaking here. And that was just magical. I had no official role of any kind in poetry at that time. About that time, I became a member of the Grand Rapids Area Council for the Humanities. And in that capacity, we would sponsor not so much poetry, but other quasi-literary events. And then the poet laureate idea was an outgrowth of the Humanities Council. And so I guess that would be my first official moment when we got involved with the Poet Laureate program. It was interesting because I think initially there was an inevitable tension between, do you identify someone based on their body of work as a poet to be honored, or someone who can play a public role and write a poem for a special occasion, or be an ambassador for poetry, work with kids in schools. And I think of 2 close friends, Bob Vandermolen and Linda Nemec Foster, as being sort of the epitome of those 2 characters. And so I have to put in a word for Bob, because Bob is a distinguished poet whose work is published here and in the UK, and is a great living poet, but it's not in Bob's temperament to wish to be publicly visible. Linda, fabulous poet also, but Linda is an extrovert compared to Bob, and Linda embraces that spirit of how can I be an ambassador for poetry. And so Linda is one of a long line of distinguished poets laureates. In a different perspective or with a different set of expectations, Bob might have been or should have been as well. But that's that was the part of the challenge in defining what the poet laureate role should be. The great thing about dyer-ives is it's so inviting. You don't have to feel, maybe a lot of us as poets are either somewhat introverted, or maybe we're self-conscious about whether our work is any good. And what's the, between sharing something in school or in a creative writing class and having a poem published in a national magazine or a selection of poems in a book, what's the bridge there, or the link? And the dyer-ives, I think, provides that link where any of us who wants to, and of course it's so marvelously broken down with students and adults and different age groups, that any of us who wants to can submit a poem. And if it's rejected, it isn't a sort of, you don't feel the public sense of rejection like getting a form letter from a publication or something. And if it's accepted, it may be our own little Grand Rapids pond, but you just feel this tremendous surge of support and encouragement. And so dyer-ives is an entree to poetry for kids and adults alike who may not think of themselves as poets, but who want to try that mode of expression. And I think that's where dyer-ives is just fills a wonderful niche. And you can't, I didn't enter with that expectation. I mean, nobody does, I assume. But again, when you're busy with other occupations and you don't have confidence that what you've written is particularly terrific, you can kind of take a chance with dyer-ives. And so I haven't written that much poetry in my life, and what little I have has been rejected in most other venues. But dyer-ives was a hospitable place, and gosh, lo and behold, you get that little kernel of recognition that makes you feel like, even if I'm never going to write much more poetry, I can at least kind of identify with that world and feel a part of that creative spirit. And that makes all the difference. That's one of those, the benefit of poetry is one of those intangibles that there's no metric that will say, we've provided meals to people in need, or we've helped with housing or medical accessibility. There are no metrics around it that I'm aware of. What it is helping create a sense of home in a world where, at the risk of making generalized assumptions, poets are pretty sensitive folks, and they can be among the great creative minds, but you need a community in which they can feel nurtured and appreciated. And I think that to the extent that dyer-ives and similar kinds of programs and a community of poetry, whether it's people coming in and reading that you otherwise would never have exposure to, or giving a chance for your own voice to be heard, that makes all the difference for those creative souls for whom poetry is kind of a holy undertaking, whether you write it or you just read it and respect it and revere it. And that's the space, I think, that dyer-ives has created, and that a poetry community creates and sort of saves people locally. You don't have to feel like, oh, if only I lived in big city X, Y, or Z that has a thriving arts community, might I find a home? You can find it here through these kinds of venues. Well, poetry is certainly distinct from business. I mean, I'm one of those people who always took heart that people like Wallace Stevens could combine two careers, and Ted Kooser did for many years as well. But it does feel like a compartmentalized life where poetry is distinct from my other work, but poetry is a way of looking at the world for people who think that words can be sort of holy, if that makes any sense. And there's nothing else quite like that. And so if you have that predilection to say, both I have something to say and I want to say it in a kind of inspired language rather than in prose, poetry is the home for that, and there is no other that I'm aware of. That poem, Comfort Inn, was just literally we were opening a store it was Normal, Illinois, and there's something so wonderfully prosaic that it's poetic to talk about Normal, Illinois. But I was sitting by myself was it in a Red Lobster? I don't know. And I mean, quite often, again, in business, I don't find myself alone that much. But in this case, I'm alone, away from home, and having come from maybe an open house at the store and greeting lots of people and anticipating the opening next day where you'll be immersed in, you hope, a lot of people. There's just this quiet moment, and it can feel sort of isolating. I mean, not in any self-pitying way, but it can feel a bit of a lonely moment away from home, and poetry gives expression to that and relieves it at the same time. And then if something miraculous happens, like it can get honorable mention in the dyer-ives, that's a treat and a bonus. I hesitate to make any grand claims for poetry as a business or a tool. It's so personal. I hope that anything we do that is that personal makes us more attuned to what is very personal and maybe vulnerable for other people. So oddly, you get that little tiny spurt of recognition from dyer-ives, and I get a few people from around our company sending me poems that they've written. And of course, there's nothing more painful than being asked to critique other people's poems, but it means that they feel like they've found a kindred spirit. And so I guess to the extent that it informs my leadership, it's one more way it's one more and very special way of connecting with a few people, but those few people are hungry for that connection. Liesl and I have been among the sponsors for the Festival of the Arts at Grand Valley for the last several years. And really from the time when UICA began and the Humanities Council began, when there had been this flourishing at Grand Valley back in the 70s, but there really weren't many things local. We would drive over to Hope College for Jack Riddle's wonderful reading program, but the local colleges weren't consistently offering programs. And then Linda and Tony Foster started their Aquinas readings, which were bringing people into Grand Rapids. Calvin began its festival of the faith in writing, and then Grand Valley comes in with their fall arts festival, and it's just this terrific flourishing. And so Grand Valley is the one that we've been connected to most recently, and they've brought in some wonderful poets in the last few years. In some ways, I would start with my friendship with Bob Vandermolen, because I admire his work so much, and that I met Dan Gerber for the first time in the early 1970s when he had a publishing venture called Sumac Press that published not only his own work, but Jim Harrison and Bob Vandermolen, great Michigan poets and poets from elsewhere. And he gave me a copy of Bob Vandermolen's first book. And that was before I ever met Bob. And I mentioned the writing workshop at community college. It was right after that I was driving down Monroe Avenue in front of the old City Hall. And this character comes along, and I can remember him in a long black overcoat, sort of flapping in the wind on a cold day. And it was Bob Vandermolen. And I remember, so in my mind, as a fan of poetry, he was already a little bit of a local celebrity. And I remember just writing a couple of lines about Vandenberg, and I gave them to him years later. Then Bob and I met a couple of years after that and became very close friends. But I was seeing him as this sort of romantic, poetic figure before we actually ever had a chance to meet.
What year was that?
That must have been about 1978. I have so few poems, but of course, and the second of my 3 dyer-ives entries was the first poem. If I can talk about my dyer-ives experience for a moment, the first dyer-ives poem I wrote was came out of I was traveling, visiting stores, and I was coming back from Mount Pleasant, maybe, and was coming through. There's a lot of Amish communities now in Montcalm County, and I came suddenly upon an Amish buggy in front of me on a very windblown, blustery fall day, and it was right around the time that a good friend of mine, who was a graduate of Union High School in Grand Rapids the same year I graduated from Creston, David Bombeck, who had been launching himself on a very successful career as a producer in Hollywood, died of AIDS. And that was fresh in my mind. And he has his first breakthrough film project as the assistant producer, or whatever his title was, but really putting it together, was the movie Witness in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with Harrison Ford as being sheltered by Amish in an Amish community. And that was that, and I had a chance to visit him on the set, and that experience, his experience of the Amish, was fresh in my mind as I'm coming on the back of this buggy, and so I'm reflecting on his life which had been lived in a very fast lane in Hollywood and come to a very abrupt conclusion with what we think of sort of stereotypically as an Amish community experience, where obviously the pace of life is much slower. And so that contrasted me. That was my first dyer-ives. My last one was the one that we were talking about before the store opening in Normal, Illinois. The middle one was just this little very short poem called Desire that has no big background story like either of the other two, and is very short, but it allows me to keep it in my head. So Desire. Let me fumble your buttons. Let me follow you home. Your blouse says yes. See how it sighs, how it catches your breath. You know you have something to say. You don't necessarily know how you're going to say it or where you're going to say it. But a contest like dyer-ives is an occasion to try it, to let your voice float out there. And you're not risking as much as you think to share that voice. And you'll feel better for having done it. and it will be your initiation, maybe, if it's the first time you've tried that, first time you've let that voice out, your initiation into a wonderful and very select tribe. I think, just from a personal perspective, from people I know and from things I read, that poetry is flourishing in Grand Rapids. And I don't know that we are all aware of that. And I'm sounding like a booster, but poetry is alive and well in Grand Rapids, and it can feel like this undercover enterprise, but there's a community of people who are out there who are practicing it, and the more we can find each other, the better we're all going to feel. That's, I guess, what I would think of as kind of this. Poetry can feel like a secret society, and you can like what you do and not like what somebody else does. I mean, it's like music. That our tastes can vary wildly, and the level of professionalism or sophistication that we bring to that work can vary wildly. But we all have something in common, an interest in pursuing the magic of words, and poetry is the place where that comes together in something special. What I don't have a sense of, just maybe because of my age or naivete, is the effect of social media on how that might have changed. So I'm assuming there are communities online that I'm not even aware of. And maybe that's affected how we think about poetry as a local village. Maybe it's a much broader village than that. And I'm still wedded to the idea that going to a reading and hearing someone express their feelings in the same room in the same voice has an effect that can't be reproduced otherwise. But there are intermediate steps now with people able to reach beyond their local community that probably are providing terrific new outlets that I'm not aware of. And I think both are important, but I'm sure there are successive generations who are finding new ways to express themselves, to find those connections that we couldn't do 30 or 40 years ago in these 70s and 80s that we're talking about, that provide alternatives. I don't know if they're better, but they are. There's greater reach and greater connectedness now than existed at that time. That you felt more like you were sometimes in a wilderness and just hungry for that connection at Race Street Gallery. I hope I hope people are feeling like poetry is more accessible today, both locally and through these other ways. I've been very fortunate to have mentors in sort of multiple spheres. And so certainly my dad and then other people I've worked with at Meijer, Earl Holton, they've been mentors through my whole life. A very important mentor and one who ties back to poetry was the longtime minister of Fountain Street Church, Duncan Littlefair. And I only occasionally attended the church, but Duncan, particularly in his retirement, he and I would get together for lunch every couple of weeks. And Duncan saw it as his mission to, I want to say, protect and nurture artists. Not that I was one, but he would talk about someone like Edna St. Vincent Millay, who died too young and who had a lot of substance abuse issues, and wondered if only I could have saved Edna St. Vincent Millay. but that was, but Duncan was whatever your passion was, he was such a powerful supporter of that. And so most of the writing I've done has not been poetry, it's been biography, but Duncan could champion that. And so I absolutely cherish him as a mentor. And then in different spheres, I worked with an editor in Plymouth who's a good friend and only a couple of years older, but Ed Wendover was a mentor in the newspaper business and could get you excited about news coming out of a school board meeting that might put the rest of us to sleep, but he could see the meaning in it, and that was terrific. And then in poetry, I would have to, in poetry, when I was in Ann Arbor, not only, I never had a class from Donald Hall, not only was he conducting a great reading series, but I did take creative writing courses from a poet named Radcliffe Squires. And so he became a poetry mentor. And then Dan Gerber has been an influence and an inspiration most of my adult life. And I mentioned Bob Vandermolen. Bob and I are closer in age, but he's certainly been someone whose work I've looked up to a lot. So a lot of mentors in a lot of different places. Because of dyer-ives, I don't have to think of myself as a failed poet. So even though I hold that as the highest of the literary arts, I don't trust myself to do enough good work in it to spend a lot of time with it. And so in writing, I think of myself as a biographer. And so I wrote a biography of Michigan Senator Arthur Vandenberg that was published 5 years ago. And I'm currently just beginning work on a biography of the Supreme Court Justice from Michigan named Frank Murphy, who was an early hero of civil liberties, civil rights, and the labor movement. And so I haven't even written anything yet. I'm just doing a lot of thinking and research, but that's my current project. Well, I guess if maybe there are three components to my engagement with poetry. The most superficial one would be modest philanthropic activity, and I'm sure glad to participate in that way. And I hope that that's been a part of what's supported a more active poetry community in Grand Rapids. And then the second component is active participation in that community through going to readings, and that has provided some of the richest memories of my life. And I mentioned hearing William Stafford in a snowstorm at Race Street, but meeting Alice Fulton at the next incarnation of Race Street, the readings at Hope College, and going to Jack Riddle's house afterwards, and meeting Yosef Kuminyata and any number of other people. Those were just indelible moments that must be like a kid who's passionate about sports meeting their favorite athletes. I mean, you carry those memories all your life. And then the third component is writing stuff, and having had the good fortune locally to be able to have a little bit of recognition through dyer-ives gives a sense of legitimacy to what is very personal work that is like nothing else. And so in my own life, as I've tried to balance a professional career in business with a creative career in writing, that's been just an invaluable little piece of confidence that says, hey, you're not just a pretender, you're you're a citizen of this community, and so those would be the how I think about all those three components.